Yep. Right, well, welcome everybody to a decision session for Executive Member for Transport, myself, Councillor de Gorn, and it's Tuesday, the 19th of April, 2022. I have a number of public speakers, but before we get to that, item one is declarations of interest. I don't have any prejudicial interests, just for interest of clarity, transparency. There are three items on the agenda, items 5, 8 and 9, which relate to Fishergate ward, which is the ward I represent. By and large, the representations I've referred to the other councillor, so as to not get involved in the toing and throwing from the objections that have been lodged. And also in relation to item 4, as you'll read from the report, that relates to a decision that I took as Executive Member for Transport following residents in Badger Hill requests for residents parking. So those are my declarations. But as I say, none of them are prejudicial to making a decision on those items. Second item is the minutes, and I'm happy to approve the minutes of the meeting of 22nd of March, which was the last meeting. Help me to those. Which takes me on to public speakers. We have a combination of speakers in person or on the phone call. The first speaker I've got on my list, I'll come back to if they appear. They're not in the room at the moment. So the first speaker will be Councillor Waters in person in relation to item 4, the ePetition. So Councillor Waters, you want to come and give us your 3 minutes worth?
Just before I start the 3 minutes, can we have a correction in the agenda, please? I notice at the agenda, the end of agenda item 4, you've got wards affected. Osborwick and Derwent. Why is Hull Road ward mentioned? Because I do recall that when you carried out the residents parking scheme in Hull Road, which had great effects on Osborwick and Derwent ward, we were never mentioned. We were never even informed formally.
I can note that, although I think the reason for putting that in is, as you'll hear shortly, there's a wards councillor for Hull Road obviously has something to say because it was action in Hull Road ward which led to the situation. So,
but the petition
it's relevant from that point of view.
The petition that is specifically referred to relates to Osborwick and Derwent ward. Okay. Nothing whatsoever to do with Hull Road ward. Right, thank you, Chair. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. A quote attributed to Albert Einstein, but you don't need to be Einstein to realise that the council's approach, as detailed in paragraph 23, with residents parking schemes, simply moves a problem. The resultant parking chaos in Osborwick and Merton isn't because of stupidity on behalf of those involved, but outright malevolence in moving the problem from one community and dumping it onto another. Since the planning approval for the vast university expansion in 2007, the effects on surrounding areas, especially with regard to accommodating the huge numbers of students, is only too evident. The displaced parking from York University and to a lesser extent Archbishop Aldgate School was largely hidden from view, as Badger Hill was virtually annexed as a surrogate car park for these two organisations. Rather than seek a long-term solution to this problem parking, the executive member decided to dump the problem in another ward. A reaction to this was the petition lodged with the council at the start of the year. 3.5 months later, you come up with this appalling report, an insult of a recommendation in paragraph 3. If promoting travel plans with university or Archie School staff and students worked, then there wouldn't have been a problem in the first place in Badger Hill for you to dump somewhere else. People with any degree of common sense realise that a solution to this has to be explored. Otherwise, because of the number 6 bus service to the campus, The whole of Oswald and large parts of Tanghall will become dumping grounds for cars as staff and students park up and get a bus to campus. These cars need to be accommodated where they belong, on campus. It ought to be, given the evident problems, sensible via a Section 73 planning application to vary the university travel plan obligations to create more on-campus parking. Or it ought to be sensible to create a park and stride or park and shuttle bus from the spare capacity at the park and ride site. What is not sensible is carrying on in this manner, deliberately creating a problem and then refusing to investigate solutions. And please, 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 do not, any of you, try and use ridiculous sustainable transport, climate change excuses to somehow cover for this fiasco. If York University was serious about mitigating its transport carbon footprint, it wouldn't be flying in huge numbers of international students, or as it did recently, busing students in from Hull accommodation. What you are recommending today is not a solution. Solve this problem that you have created. Thank you.
Comments which we noted when we come to that item. The second speaker I have is Councillor Pavlovic, who is, I believe, on the line.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
We can. Do you want to say what you've got to say? I believe you're representing the whole road ward.
Well, I believe I still represent the whole road ward, which is a huge relief. And thank you, Councillor, and I'd like to thank the officers for the report. And I take great objection to the comments of the residents' parking scheme for Badger Hill being described as malevolent. As ward councillor for Hull Road, I've always strived to be responsive to the needs of members of the ward, as we all are. And therefore, whilst I totally understand the strength of feeling of the residents of Councillor Waters' ward and his efforts to respond to them, I take great exception to describing residents' parking as being designed against him. Sorry, I'm deviating from my script slightly. But the need to address a problem with non-resident parking in Badger Hill and the surrounding area was one that as ward councillors we couldn't ignore. And for years, residents of Badger Hill have felt they were living in a university overflow car park, as Councillor Waters has mentioned. Whether this was because of not enough parking on campus, or more likely that staff and students didn't want to pay the charges, is immaterial to the impact that it had on residents. They asked for residents' parking. We addressed that as part of a consultation, and the process that you approved was one that I think would have been difficult to have ignored. But the impact, the knock-on impact, could have been predicted, which is why the planning condition was put in place with the annual travel and parking survey. In Badger Hill, the thresholds were being breached year after year, and that's only right that the university and the council found mitigation measures. And having introduced the Respark scheme, the issue of excessive parking on the estate has largely been resolved. But I acknowledge there has been a cost, and that is the displaced parking we've now seen in the zones outside Badger Hill. The travel survey in those areas may now also show non-resident parking in excess of the thresholds, and therefore presumably the university should be offering the same mitigation measures as they did in Hull Road. There cannot be a Respark scheme anywhere in the city that hasn't seen parking then displaced to the areas nearby. And that's what we've seen in Oswald and Derwent. It's clear that something needs to be done to support Councillor Waters' residents who are affected, but this cannot be at the expense of the much improved situation for residents in Badger Hill. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. The next speaker I have, taking item 4 speakers altogether. So Councillor Rowley, if you want to.
Thank you, Chair. If I might just take 30 seconds prior to my 3 minutes, Chair, just to thank those residents from our ward that have turned up in person, and also those residents that are watching online. We appreciate your support greatly, and thank you for going to the trouble of being here this morning. Chair, I want to speak obviously to item 4 and the situation that we find ourselves in Oswald. I want to just state very clearly and categorically that I absolutely oppose the extension of any resident parking scheme in any area of my ward. Whilst it's not in my power to stop it, I will do everything that I can to protect the integrity of my ward and the parking that the residents in my ward currently have. I also refuse to support any double yellow lines being used as a means to reduce parking in residential areas, except for those obvious road safety reasons. Chair, I want to challenge the recommendations on page 9 of the report, suggesting that you as the executive member approve an increased engagement by the school travel team with Archbishop Holgate School and the University of York. I am absolutely aghast that that's the recommendation of highly paid, highly skilled officers to simply recommend an increase in the engagement. The petition calls for the council to solve the issue of parking and not just move it. The recommendations before you this morning don't do that at all. Archbishop Holgate School. I am a governor at Archbishop Holgate School, and following Councillor Waters' letter to the head teacher, I had a meeting with the head, the chair of governors, and the head of the sixth form at which this was discussed. The reality is not many of Archbishop Holgate students drive. 1 or 2 of them do, because they live outside of any bus lanes, any bus routes, and again, that's something that you as the executive member for transport could take a look at, and therefore they do have to drive. I have had meetings with the school, and the school is proactive in trying to resolve some of the parking issues that their students may be causing. They're also looking at the possibility of increasing their on-site parking, but again, you'll understand to do this, they need to balance the need for not wanting to encourage students to drive to the school. University of York. It's my belief that the university should take responsibility for their growth and success in attracting both staff and students to the university. Simply encouraging students, as in the report, not to bring cars to the university is not enough. It's a little bit like telling a dog not to bark when it's upsetting the neighbours. The university is complicit in its encouraging of students into houses of multiple occupation. Many of those HMOs are in my ward. By definition, these houses have driveways and are usually occupied by students who bring cars. In a house with an occupation usually of 6, that's the average number of HMOs in our ward. Of those 6, it's very often the case that 3 cars belong to that household. Where are they going to park? They've got 1 car park on the drive and then 2 on the main road. This issue is something that has to be addressed properly and has to be addressed in a way that is sustainable and realistic. Negotiations and discussions with the university, responsibility by the university to look at resolving this properly in some of the ways that Councillor Waters has put forward is what I recommend that you do. And Chair, I am asking you not to take the recommendations given to you by the officers. Thank you.
I'll add that one to overrun a little bit, but I think it's important to hear, given the petition. So the next speaker I have is relates to item 6, is Mr. Anthony Unwin. There's a green button to speak if it's not already lit.
I'm not going to hit you with this. I hope. Can I just say first, I'm very deaf. I haven't heard anything that's gone
So
before.
can you press
I don't think this is a translator, but it hasn't really worked.
Yeah, can you press
and
the
loop
green
system
button?
isn't really working either.
Is it? Okay.
So if you have any questions afterwards, it might be a little bit more complicated. Anyway, here we go. I'm here to speak about the Main Street Fulford development. Margaret Thatcher famously said at one point there is no such thing as society, but even she would have agreed that there is such a thing as community. And I am of a generation that believe community is important. And the two big pillars that can hold that together are relationships between neighbours and relationships between the council and the neighbours. And there's no question in my mind whatsoever that the proposals for parking that were submitted in October of last year would cause both of those to crumble quite considerably. I'm not here to be critical of the planning department because those proposals were based on a misunderstanding, which has been well addressed in the propositions that my neighbours and the church next door have put in the recent submissions. It particularly affected me because, having lived at my house for 30 years, I have had multiple sclerosis for some time. I live alone and I've struggled to maintain my independence, and my ability to park has been a large part of that. And this would have been blown asunder by the proposals in November, to the point that I would probably have to have considered moving. The church in their recent submissions have corrected any misunderstandings that there may have been. They say in their recent submission that the current arrangements work very well for them, and that the arrangements as proposed in November would have less flexibility and certainly make matters worse, which is something in which I concur. Again, the council, the planning department, to their credit, have taken on board the submissions and have changed the plans to leave in effect the status quo. And that is what I'm here today to support. I spoke to the vicar of St.Oswald last week outside, and she gave me her blessing, if that is the right word, to say that the church is quite happy with the status quo, and I could quote her on that. My neighbour next door is certainly happy that it's been overturned. The reason I'm here today is it is of such importance to me, and just couldn't stay at home twiddling my thumbs whilst this decision was being put through, in case something came up at the midnight hour and I wasn't here to possibly ask any questions or anything that had been raised in the interim. So that really is all I have to say. I'm not here to rehash old arguments about how things could be improved or not. That's for another day, possibly down the road. But if there are any questions on anything that's happened since we got the documentation a few weeks ago that I can help with, I'll try and answer, but it'll be slightly difficult to hear your question.
No, that is fine. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
contributions. We'll take that into account when we get to that item.
Well, if I don't stay anymore, it's not a sign of disrespect. It's
No,
just that I can't hear a word of what's being said.
Okay. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you for your time.
The next speaker I have relates to item 7, is Councillor Fenton, who I believe is on the line. So this is the revival estate scheme, I believe. Do we have Councillor Fenton on the line?
Yep. Morning, Chair.
Good morning. Would you like to give us your thoughts on this particular thorny issue?
Yep. Thank you very much. The first thing to say is I note the majority of responses to the consultation were in support of the proposed scheme 19 to 17, which followed the formal ballot, which showed support from 71% of the 43% of households that took the trouble to respond. Although it's fair to say, and you'll see from reading the consultation responses, that there is no consensus at the moment. I do wish that it had not been necessary to consult on a Respark scheme, but the fact that we are here is a culmination of a number of factors, one of which is arguably the impact of York College's parking policy. Some objectors state that the scheme would be discriminatory on age grounds. If age discrimination forms one of the reasons for not proceeding with the scheme, it does rather beg the question whether the Respark schemes that have been implemented in the areas around the University of York are also considered to be unfairly discriminatory. I don't believe that it would be appropriate for any educational institution to seek to somehow outsource to neighbouring residential streets the issue of how to better support students who have no realistic means of getting to their place of education other than private car, but who fall foul of that organisation's parking policy. The report seems to suggest that the problem which prompted the request for a Respark scheme has gone away, but Annex D gives no indication whether the count of available spaces includes the private car parks on Scholars Court and Masters Mews, and this needs to be made clear. Recent anecdotal evidence from residents suggests that some college students are now parking at the new Park and Ride site, which, if true, obviously is not a sustainable solution. So I think the survey somewhat misses the point, as the proposed Respark scheme was never about a shortage of on-street parking. It was about the at times dangerous and inconsiderate parking by a minority of students. It's undeniable that there is a cost of living crisis, but I must admit that this is the first time I've seen the cost of a permit cited as a reason for not proceeding with the Respark scheme, but I'm happy to be corrected by officers on that point. A permit would of course not be needed by those households that are able to park on a driveway or in an allocated parking space, though I appreciate that this will provide no comfort for those households that through choice or perhaps necessity own multiple vehicles which they want to park on street weekdays between 10 AM and 3 PM. The report refers to the potential for additional yellow lines. I have no issue with looking again at whether further restrictions are needed, but will this in itself prevent dangerous or irresponsible parking on the estate? And I do have my doubts. Finally, I was assured in an email in January that the request for a 20-mile-an-hour limit on the estate would also be covered at this meeting, but this gets no mention in the papers for the meeting, which is deeply disappointing to me and to residents. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take those points into account when we come to that item. Thank you for your contributions. The next speaker I have relates to item 5, Mrs. Anwen Hughes, who's on the line. Yes, and this relates to the the Kilburn Road, Alma, Terrace, Alma Grove proposal. Do you want to give us your 3 minutes worth?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Just before I start my 3 minutes, I emailed 3 questions regarding the timing of the stages of implementation of R70 and if there were any legal timescales between legal notice going up and implementation of the scheme. I think it would be helpful if these could be considered in decision session, particularly pertinent to Alma Terrace and Alma Grove. So I'm a long-term resident of Alma Terrace and I support and welcome the decision to implement the R70 Respark scheme in Alma Terrace and Alma Grove and the recognition of the resident parking issues we face. However, I object to the proposals to delay this implementation. I ask rather than option 1 that an amended proposal to option 2 is taken forward to implement the Alma Terrace and Grove Respark scheme as soon as possible with Kilburn Road, but also proceed in parallel and as soon as possible with display of legal notices and call for representations on extension of R70 to adjacent streets to the south. Parking pressures in the Almas are already severe and the need for action is urgent. This has been repeatedly explained by Alma residents, not just recently, but over many years, in previous petitions, surveys, decision meetings, in the large number of individually penned responses in support of the legal notice. To reiterate the issues and why this is more urgent than for the adjacent streets. In Alma Terrace, parking is only possible on one side of the carriageway with houses on both sides. This is not the case for adjacent streets. Alma Terrace is well known, provided direct and convenient access to the riverside and a footpath to the city centre. The Almas are used for parking by commuters, shoppers and casual riverside and city centre users. This means the pressures at all hours of day and evening. This well known and signposted direct access is not the case for the adjacent streets. The process has already taken years, and despite this acute need, based on previous progress, the delay will mean we'll have to wait at least a further year for some undetermined date in the future, and likely to be after May 2023 before a Respark scheme is in place. When it comes to the proposed options, the report places a higher weighting to objections in adjacent streets than the overwhelming support of the residents in the Almas for a scheme in their own street. Some of these concerns and the report's reasoning are misplaced. For example, residents of the Almas can already park on adjacent streets. If this is a problem, then surely implementing Respark in the Almas will ease this, because ending parking by casual users will free up parking for Alma residents. The suggestion that Alma residents will park in adjacent streets to avoid permit charges is misplaced, given the nominal fees involved versus the inconvenience, and the fact that there were only 2 objections from the Almas based upon cost. It's not clear why signage would have to be put up and removed. The res parking signs don't name streets, just the zone. Signs at the entrance to Alma Terrace could have a beneficial effect in deterring casual parking in adjacent streets to the south, leading from this road. Even if signs did need to change, the cost would be minimal compared to the permit fees gathered from early implementation of an Alma scheme. So to conclude, it's taken a concerted effort and engagement by the residents of Alma Terrace and Grove over several years to get the proposals for a Respark scheme approved. The process of campaigning, petition, survey and consultation and legal notice responses, representation at multiple decision meetings has been incredibly slow and exhausting. Now we are being told we have to wait even longer for an already acute parking problem. So to take forward a revised option 2 of progressing the Alma scheme with Kilburn Road as soon as possible, while in parallel, or the revised option 2, while in parallel advertising the extension of R70 to the south, would seem to be the fairest, most democratic way forward. It would recognise the urgent need in the Almas, the prolonged demographic efforts of the residents and strong support for the scheme in the Almas, while also acknowledging the recently expressed concerns by taking proposals forward in the adjacent streets.
Thank you very much for your comments. I'll take that into account when we come to that item. Move on now to Margaret James, also on the same item, I believe is on the line.
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Andy.
Hello. Would you like to say, give us your 3 minutes worth? I don't know if you heard the previous speaker, but it was on the same item.
I did, yes. And okay. I would follow in the same vein from what Anwen said. I've been, myself and Catherine Crocker, we started this in November 2018 with the first survey of residents on the terrace and in the Grove. We got an overwhelming response in favour at that time, though it does seem a long while ago now. I personally have canvassed residents of Alma Grove 3 times since then, all of which have had a positive result in favour of res parking. I know that approval was granted in principle by the Transport Executive meeting on the 21st of September 2021, making the Grove, the Terrace and Kilburn Road R70. Since then, obviously, we've been waiting, and now we hear that it could be put back at least another 18 months. To what effect, to what end, I do not understand. Nothing has improved regarding parking on the Grove and the Terrace since the original survey. When the early work was being carried out on the student accommodation site, which is the reason, one of the reasons for wanting residence parking before that is filled with students, the workforce on that site were parking on the terrace and in the Grove every day. And it was an absolute nightmare trying to get parked. If you left your spot that morning to get back in, it just wasn't going to happen. The further impact of students parking as from September will be even worse. Whereas the workers were parking and leaving at approximately 5, 6 o'clock, the students will be parking at all times. I would also make a note, the point that if we have to resurvey the residents, we're in danger of getting voting fatigue for the number of times they've been canvassed and been asked to vote by the council. All the voting so far has been in favour, not very far below the 50% on the Terrace and the Grove. When we found out about the R70 zone, that was greeted as an even greater win for the Grove and Terrace. I think I remember at the last meeting in September, there was mention of a very poor response from Ambrose and Francis, and that at that they would be put in the next tranche of res parking, which was 18 months away. Now I find that there is a danger of the Alma Grove, Alma Terrace being put back a further 18 months. So what will be achieved by doing that is just beyond me. It's a very unhelpful intervention to the residents. It would now seem that 3.5 years later from the first survey we did, we're not a lot further forward in reaching our goal. And I would urge the executive to reconsider putting back the residents' parking on the Alma Grove, Alma Terrace, and keeping them with the R70 into Kilburn. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. The next speaker I've got is Catherine Crocker on the same item. Let me see here.
As you say, my name is Catherine Crocker, Alma Terrace. I'm here today to reiterate what others have already said and what some of my neighbours away on holiday and not able to attend the meeting would like to say. As Margaret's just suggested, back in November 2018, we collected a petition from our neighbours and submitted it to the council. Now it's 3.5 years later, and I do despair at the process. And the pressure in the parking situation on the Almas has not diminished. In fact, it's got much, much worse. And we've seen it demonstrated by the workforce that are actually working on the building site opposite Alma Terrace. But like Margaret says, if we have increased student occupation, that will be a 24 hours parking problem, whereas it's a daytime problem with the workers. So in this period of time, we've been in limbo, 3.5 years, I'll add again. Streets around us have been given residents parking, and also that increases our pressure because traffic actually still parking in our street, and shoppers, visitors, people that like a little walk out of town are coming into our streets. The council has also granted 600 plus students planning permission for buildings that are going to be provided in the Fulford Road, Fishergate area. That's a hell of a lot of students. And from my experience with the students in our area, in our streets, actually, they all rock up with cars. And just even if it's a small percentage of the multiple occupancy. So the future looks pretty dismal for us. You're suggesting that we're going to have to wait further and the pressure is going to increase. The students move into that new building, 300 plus on opposite Alma Terrace will be moving in probably by the end of the year. That's a hell of a lot. So there should be a council strategy to decrease cars coming into York. There should be enforced student car parking for that building should not be reappearing on our streets. Park and ride along Fulford Road is very good. The pollution is chronic. I mean, we were asked not to leave our homes in the mid-April because it was so bad. So it's a council strategy to actually take into account that the Almas now need resident parking, R70 along with Kilburn Road. And we can't afford to wait any longer. As I say, I've been on with this for 3.5 years. To spend another 1.5 years of this fills me with despair.
Thank you for your comments. Consider that when we get to that item. I've now got Marina Knight from a Revival Estate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take from where we have heard our last speakers. Time, over 3 years, where we have also heard Councillor Fenton. Unfortunately, 3 minutes are not enough for me to say everything I've got to say. So I will cut to the main points. Number one, the safety of the residents on the Revival Estate. The children of Revival do have a right to move around their own estate on pavements. This is and has been impossible for these residents. This is meaning subsequently that we are also discriminating against disabled people, mothers with young children. One of the objections that you will have received has tabled 14 cars on pavements, and that particular objection, it was an objection to the parking scheme. So I am hoping that this is 14 cars too many for you councillors. Regularly, you come driving on junctions and you come down blind corners, only to be greeted with a car which you had no way of spotting that will instantly mount the pavement. I urge you to bear these images in your minds because they are something of a daily occurrence on that estate. Number two, the houses of Revival, and I stress here the houses, not the flats of Revival estate, are not and should not be a free car park. I believe that owning a car is a privilege, to own it, to drive it, but it should not come with an assumption that parking it anywhere should be guaranteed and free of charge. Yeah, we have many parking resident permits around York. And one of the objections that I have seen in this last document is that this would be discriminatory against people who have perhaps not got the same means, financial means as others. Yes, but this is true of all the other parking schemes that you'd have got running in York. It is discriminating, I believe, to say that anyone can park free of charge at the Revival houses, but the privileged houses in the Square, in the Grove and Cheshingham Gardens all have 24-hour free restrictions, yeah, free of charge because of their double yellow lines. Not to mention the hypocritical York College that itself restricts its own students from parking on their own grounds, as you've already heard. Again, the same flat resident who tabled parked cars on the estate missed tabling the number of empty parking spaces at the flats. These are spaces which are only available for the people who pay for them, not for everyone else. And at the same time, we do have cars parked on pavements. And number three, finally, the costs for residents. Every house on that estate has been designed with a minimum of 2 parking spaces, 1 parking space, 1 garage, hence place to park 2 cars off-road, no cost involved. If you own 3 or more cars, you should be able to afford what would be a very small percentage of running these extra cars in the form of a resident parking permit, which I want to stress would only be operational for the working hours of the day. And I want to finish by saying that I am in a very deep hope and belief that your council is indeed aiming to run an environmentally friendly city where people are, before committing to driving a car, hopefully thinking before committing onto that journey and leaving the car dumped anywhere for a number of hours. Also, ultimately, have I finished?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, if that was the last second.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So that concludes the public speakers, unless Councillor Myers has appeared, which I don't see at the moment. So we'll move on to the next item. So the first item we've got is item 4, the university petition. So I'll pass over to officers to respond to comments and representations you've received.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So there's no updates to the report. As you'll see, Annex A is the petition that Councillor Waters organised, which responds to the displaced parking problems in Oswald, particularly on Tranby Avenue. As you've heard from all your public speakers, res parking is an emotive issue both for and against. The way Respark has worked in the city and continues to work is that where there is displacement, that then progresses, and that community who is then affected can petition for a Respark scheme. And that is the way the council, rightly or wrongly, has chosen to set its policy position about how Respark is rolled out. although I do note the comments from both ward councillors that they don't want Respark in Oswaldwick. As you can see, at Annex B, officers have been out and monitored both car parks and found relatively high levels of occupancy of the university car parks. We don't really have a magic solution for this. We'll continue to work with the educational establishments, the university and the school, and officers have already opened that engagement, as obviously have the ward councillors. A Respark zone is obviously an option should those communities want it, but I also hear the representations from the ward councillors. And the proposal for double yellow is on the forward plan for May's decision session at Tranby Avenue, which is in Annex C. I think other than continuing to work with the university, if the residents don't want a Respark, then we haven't really got, I'm not sure of a solution that we can force through in another way.
Just on that particular point, there was one representation which was sent in a written representation, which I think might be helpful just to maybe if we not necessarily today, but if someone from the planning department could respond to just clarify the questions that have been raised. Was asking about the planning consent and suggesting that there was some change of use because the university was charging for the use of it. But I think that was all part of the original planning consent, that there would be a scale of charges for staff and students making use of the car park. So, you know, although I have read all of the representations that have been sent to me, that particular one I felt might need some clarity because it was posing particular questions about whether or not that was within their powers to be charging.
Yeah, we will double check that the way the car parks have been operated is in accordance with the existing planning approvals. So I can go away and get the team to double check that.
Okay, so basically what the recommendations are saying, obviously we've already heard there's been some engagement with Archbishop Holgate School, and again that as we've heard, one of the ward councillors is actually a governor, and so has had that communication with the school. It does seem from this report as though that's not being particularly identified as the cause of the problem, so much as displacement parking from people who are using surrounding streets to then walk or presumably get a bus from there to the university. I mean, it does seem to me that the provisions in the planning consent were for the immediate vicinity, which was particularly Badger Hill was the first area that's affected. The further that people have to walk from parking the cars, the more of an incentive I would have thought that rather than driving part of the way and getting the bus, they might as well get on the bus to start with, from depending on where they live, of course, or use some other means of transport. So I think we do acknowledge that, as you'll have heard from all the various speakers, parking is an emotive issue, and the residents' parking scheme is very much designed to give priority to residents on their own street, where people are taking advantage of free parking to park somewhere other than outside their own house. And we do have to take account of the needs of local businesses, schools, and so on. So by my way of thinking, the recommendations that have been put forward do make sense. We do have to acknowledge, as Councillor Pavlovic pointed out, that the residents of Badger Hill have been affected over a number of years, and they chose through the process to identify that they wanted residents parking as a solution to their problems. And Councillor Pavlik, to be fair, is representing his residents, saw that as the most appropriate solution. Now, obviously, the displacement parking is now affecting a different ward, and it's entirely within the gift of the ward councillors that represent those wards to put forward the solutions that they see as being most appropriate. But I have to be guided by what we have legal powers to actually put in place. We can obviously make representations, and I'm sure that that is open to the ward council as well, to make representations to the university. But beyond what is already in the planning consent, we don't have any further controls that we can apply to the university in terms of how they make use of the car parks that they have on their site. So the proposal on, which is referenced on page 21, I believe, is that what you're saying will come forward to the next decision session?
Yeah, so that's due to come to it's on the forward plan for your 17th of May.
Okay.
That double yellow line.
And these are proposals which have obviously been drawn up in the light of looking at the situation on the ground and reflecting the importance of maintaining safe passage for vehicles along Tranby Avenue. Now, between now and that decision, it's obviously open to the ward councillors and the residents in the area to say whether or not they feel those are appropriate measures before decisions taken. And when we advertise traffic regulation orders, I can see from this plan it covers a stretch up as far as Cavendish Grove. Now, if residents feel that that's excessive, then at that point, when we discuss the proposals, that they can be reduced if that is deemed as appropriate. So that will be a decision for the meeting in May. But beyond that, I acknowledge, as you've heard, not just from the speakers from Oswald Wick, elsewhere in the city, the impact of student accommodation and students having cars and expecting to be able to park them on the streets does have a knock-on effect on local communities. And the solution that we have in the city at the moment is basically to give priority parking. Now, obviously, if they're residents and live in the street, they're entitled to apply for a permit, same as anyone else. So it's not discriminating in that respect. But if they are in a purpose-built block, as is the case in relation to the other item, which we'll come into later, which doesn't provide for parking, then it's obviously unfair on the surrounding residents to have to fight for spaces outside their own house when it's displacement parking. So I know that this recommendations, which will come forward to the meeting in May, and approve the proposals as they are to go forward, and obviously open to further representations at that meeting. I'll conclude that item and move on to item 5, which is Kilburn, Alma, etc. I don't know who's somebody going to.
Yeah, well, I'll just give a very
one.
brief introduction, and then I'll pass over to Anne-Marie and let her talk you through the detail. I think the only thing I would say in response to the public speakers is that we're not proposing to consult, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anne-Marie, but we're not proposing to consult those streets again. It's purely about the phasing of implementation. So there seems to be a suggestion that we're consulting Alma Terrace and Alma Grove again, and that is not the suggestion.
You'll be going through the legal
yeah
notification process. Yeah.
So Anne-Marie, do you want to sort of talk through the detail?
Yeah, that's correct. We're not going out to consult with the residents again. The recommendation is to go straight to advertising for Wenlock, Ambrose and Francis Street. But obviously, while that is ongoing, it would put Alma Terrace on hold in the hope that there would be no objections from the other streets, and then it can all be implemented at the same time. It would not be 18 months. I don't know where that figure's been brought from. And it would be hopeful, if not guaranteed, that it can be implemented before the end of the year.
I've got a couple of sort of fairly specific questions. Firstly, Kilburn Road, I mean, that's the one which is most straightforward. You know, there was clear majority of residents voting and in support of it. And you know, I think we had a very high response rate in support of that. Obviously, they have the most direct impact from the student accommodation, which, as I understand it, will actually be, I looked online last night for advertising availability for this September. So it's quite clear that that is their expectation that will be ready for occupation by the start of the university term, which is October of this year. So Kilburn Road, as I said, that's fairly straightforward. The only one slight concern which had been raised was about liaising with the allotments over the signage, because they have a small car park at the end of the road, which is for allotment holders' use. So presumably obviously it's up to them about signage that they might put on the gate, but just so that we can be clear that they're alerted to the fact that there will be at that point there will be a sign that says end of permit zone.
We can put end signage up. Once it gets to their private land, they would then be responsible for putting signage on there.
Okay, so if we can just sort of liaise with them about the timing when that will happen, so that you know they can prepare a suitable sign for their own land.
I have sent all the details to them at each step of the way, but nothing's come back to me personally.
Okay, I'll try and make sure that they know as well anyhow. But yeah, that's helpful. And when we notify the decision, will that also go to Edgware Road? Because I'm aware that's not within the zone because it's an unadopted road, isn't it?
That's unadopted, yes, so they're not included. They got the letter informing them of the recommendation and the meeting today.
Yeah, I think there is one
there was one representation from Edgware,
Yeah, and that was about access to permits, but because they're not part of the area, they can't be included.
No, they was wanting to be able to purchase permits to park on Kilburn Road, but they're not part of the boundary, and we didn't get a high enough response rate with it being a private road to include them.
Okay, yeah, so I'm just sort of clarifying that point. So I'm happy with the recommendation in relation to Kilburn Road, which is to implement.
Yep. You may have been about to do this, so apologies, Chair, if you were. Is it worth asking Anne-Marie to explain why she was proposing that you made a decision on Alma Terrace and Alma Grove, but delayed implementation? Because understanding the rationale for that, I think is important.
That would be helpful, I do. I mean, it is something which I think a lot of the objections related to, weren't they, about the displacement effect?
Yes.
But do you want to explain that a little bit?
Obviously, we advertised for Alma Terrace, Alma Grove only, which then brought about the realisation from the rest of the area that they would then not be able to be included in the scheme and utilise that on-street parking facility. To take into account of that, it is recommended to delay implementation on Alma Terrace because of the work that's involved in getting the scheme up and running, the permit system for all the addresses, the signs that need to be implemented. They need to go through our depot and be planned in advance with street works, and to be able to have to go then remove them signs and relocate them signs maybe a couple of months down the line. It just seems that it would not help the whole of the area if it was implemented in 2 stages.
Right. I mean, I have listened I must admit, initially that given the representations, that did seem to be a logical way forward. But having listened to the representations, and also I did a little calculation in terms of the timescale that we've operated under to get this far. And as was said, the decision was taken in September last year. So the decision was taken in September. The notices were advertised in January, and we're now in April, which my calculations is 7 months.
Yeah.
Now we've only got 6 months left before the end of September, which means that, and that's up to the decision point now. We've still got another, 8 to 12 weeks in terms of actually ordering the signs and getting letters out to people and so on.
Yeah.
So what I am minded to approve today is to go ahead with Alma Terrace and Alma Grove, or to give the approval for that to go ahead. So it's clear to everybody that that's happening. And as you've suggested or was suggested by one of the speakers, in parallel to advertise the TRO, the traffic regulation order for residents parking for Francis Ambrose and Wenlock Terrace, Kerry Street, which is the remainder of that area, for that to actually commence at the same time. But acknowledging that given the timescale we've had, I don't feel it's fair to residents of Alma Terrace for them to be held back by the other. But I think if it's done in parallel, there may not be that long a period between implementation for Alma Terrace and then a decision on the rest of the area. And I'm conscious also what you said about the signs, but having looked at if you look at the plan that we've got for the R70 area, basically what would be at issue would be just one set of signs that would need to be erected on Carey Street. And at the point in time, assuming that the residents for the rest of the area don't raise significant objections, and it is agreed that it's extended, that sign would then just be moved to Wenlock Terrace, and that would effectively, so you wouldn't have to be paying out for signs that are being wasted, as has been pointed out. They're a standard sign which would say residents parking beyond this point R70. So that if it was to be done in stages, then there'd just be one set of signs that need to be moved from Carey Street to Wenlock Terrace at the point in time when the approval has gone through.
Yeah, it's just the streetworks lead time that we need. So I was mindful that if you got the advertisement out for the remaining area, there wouldn't be that much time delay.
Yeah, well, I appreciate. I appreciate that. I think obviously you understand the sort of processes that go through to actually get signs up. I think generally speaking, if possible, we attach them to lampposts if there's one in the right place. Yeah. If not, then they're on a separate post, which obviously doesn't need a hole in the ground. But I think particularly, as I said, having checked the situation with the student block, which is obviously what was driving this, I think it's really important when those students arrive, they actually see a sign directly opposite where they're staying that indicates quite clearly to them that they are not able to park their car there without a permit. So I appreciate that this is slightly, not quite what we were working towards, and I appreciate the efforts that officers have put into this, but having reflected on the timescale, I think it is really important that the Kilmer, well, obviously we can do Kilburn. If Kilburn and Alma could be done at the same time, it could be timetabled, as you say, if it needs booking, it could be timetabled to be done in September. So there may not be that much difference in time between that and the further decision, but it could, certainly in my estimation, it could be, it could be 3 or 4 months later when the rest of the area gets a permit system in place, and that is obviously enough time for particularly given the fact that we don't have physical permits in windows, that the signs are really important to get that message over to new residents to the area that it is going to be a residents parking surrounding streets.
Can I just check your decision? So I think what you say. Can I just check your decision just to make sure we've understood correctly? So I think what you're saying is implement Kilburn, Alma Grove and Alma Terrace now, and then as soon as possible legally advertise Francis Ambrose Street, Holly Terrace, Carey Street and Wenlock Terrace with a view to implementing as soon as we can after that.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
I appreciate it does depend on work schedules and permits, but I think it would be much preferable to have that leeway between now and September to get the permits issued, the signs and so on for Alma, rather than leaving everybody in limbo until possibly November time before a decision on the whole area is made.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that? Yeah.
Some residents. Yeah, it's not just.
Yeah, I appreciate. I mean, obviously, the residents, large majority of the objections in here were from residents, I think, who live outside the area that's been advertised. So one would hope that they will be in support of a scheme being introduced on their street. Obviously, the people who haven't responded might respond with objections, but we have to look at those and consider them, as part of the legal process. But it's just basically saying, if we can start that process as quickly as possible, then there may not be too big a time lapse between the first phase, which we're talking about today, and the remainder of that area, which we all acknowledge is going to be impacted by displacement if there's any significant time difference. But on balance, I think it's really important to get that message to new students who are moving to that area that this is happening, it's a process that's underway, and that those streets won't be available for parking. Was that clear enough? Is there anything else that I needed to cover on that? I don't think so. Okay, thank you very much for that item. So then we move on to item 6, which is Main Street Fulford. This is one that the speaker addressed, one of the speakers addressed on page 91. So I'm familiar with this because it's been backwards and forwards a little bit, hasn't it?
We've been, sorry, we'll hand over to Anne-Marie in just a second. Obviously, this has been out through the process now, but based on the responses, we're not proposing any further action. Anne-Marie, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, or
there's nothing. There's been no changes, nothing to add to the report. It was, when it was first advertised, it included an extra bay in front of the church at the end of the double yellow lines, which is where the complaints have come about, because after the first advertisement and objections received and concerns about that bay, it then got removed to be advertised as double yellow lines. on the basis that a lot of the parking taking place is on the grass verges currently, and that wouldn't be able to happen if the scheme was implemented.
This one isn't in my ward, but I mean, I appreciate that the grass verges are adopted, are they?
Yeah.
So it's within the control of the council to address that, but you were saying that the proposal was to have double yellow lines, presumably, was it, on there to improve sight lines?
To remove the bay and put double yellow lines because of the sight lines coming out of the church car park, and also for access for the bus stop, for the buses pulling in as well.
Right. So the recommendation, just so I'm clear, the recommendation is basically to make no change, which
No
also is
changes.
leaving the short stay bay across on the opposite side of the road, I think.
The opposite, the one on the opposite side
Yeah.
would remain as is.
As is, which, because the church, I think, said that they benefited from that.
Yes, they do. The church also wanted the proposed bays, if it was to go ahead, to be increased in time limit,
Right.
so that they could also utilise that space.
So oh, you mean that if the Respark bays,
If the Respark bays
yeah,
were progressed,
then they wanted some short stay there as
Yeah.
well. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm wouldn't say exactly happy, but I can see that the least worst option seems to be leave the status quo as it is.
There are three options within the report. There's an option 3, which is basically option 1, but to keep it under review.
Right. Well, I'm happy to keep it under review. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about such a small number of properties, then, 50% is 2 people, and, over years, people's life changes and different occupancy and so on. So it may be that a different group of residents in 5 years' time want something different. So we can certainly keep it under review if that helps.
I mean, in effect, it's option 1, but it preserves your position, is my understanding. Is that your view of it?
yeah, the option 3 was so that they could remain on the list rather than going back to the bottom of the waiting list, in case residents on Heslington Road came to us requesting a scheme, and then we could look at the bigger area and providing the more spaces which the residents are after.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm happy to go with option 3 if it helps in terms of. I think one of the other things which we probably do need to look at is whether we should be formalising the parking that is taking place, because if from memory, it's not really, it's a bit of a euphemism to call it a grass verge, it's an area of mud.
I mean, the way, if it's adopted highway, the same rules apply as applied to the road. So if it's got double yellow lines, then we can enforce. If it hasn't, it's very difficult to enforce. I believe there was a whole scrutiny topic on it not that long ago. So double yellow lines do that, but we also do work with wards to prevent verge parking by putting in bollards, etc. So that's something the ward could look at if they wanted to control that.
Okay, well, as I said, it's just outside of my ward, so I'll leave that to the ward councillor to deal with.
Sorry, could I just say that in the previous report, it was addressed, and it was recommended that bollards were implemented if the scheme was progressed.
I see.
I mean, the bollards have already gone to the ward scheme, and they're holding off the results of this meeting first. So it's already in place, and we could still also say that the bollards go ahead through ward funding.
Well, okay, so if that's, well, I suppose if that's within the ward scheme, then that's fine. And
We
I
can
don't
pick
have
that
a
up
problem. We can pick that one up separately. Yeah, and appreciate from reading all the representations, there's some sort of complications about trying to maintain visibility for people exiting the church car park.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, move the microphone. That moves us on then to agenda item 7, which is the revival estate. And again, this is one where there's been quite a long-running attempts to try and resolve the concerns. I probably should say that I no longer work at York College, but having worked there for a number of years, I am aware of the issues about parking and student behaviour and so on, which I can understand may be of concern, but it's not necessarily something we can address through parking schemes. Do you want to introduce this?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, you know, a difficult one. The officers, rightly so, presented the objections within the report, and I think cost of living is, I think Councillor Fenton is probably right. It's the first time that residents have reflected that to us, but you know, that is what residents have told us, which is why we've reflected it in the report. Just to respond to Councillor Fenton's other comment about the 20 miles per hour, that is a piece of work that is in hand and will be coming forward to one of your decision sessions. Okay. Because we're not proposing anything in here as a parking restriction, we've kept it into a separate report. The recommendation is not to do anything on residents parking, but to look at opportunities for double yellow lines addressing that point of safety. So there was 2 recommendations in there, one of which is not to pursue the residents parking, but to add revival estates, the annual review, so that we can look at where there should be double yellow lines to maintain safety and control parking on footpaths if necessary. I don't know whether there's anything you want to add, Amory. We've also got Jeff on the phone, who is the author of this report. So any specific questions, we may need to bring him in.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that the survey was just on the highway. It wasn't in any of the private car parking spaces, because obviously we don't control them.
Okay, right. Yes, I understand that the flats have got their own, or one allocated space per flat, haven't they, for the majority of the flats, so there might be 1 or 2 that don't.
Some of them don't have allocated parking, yeah.
Yeah, and they presumably then were impacted by the potential residents parking. The survey that was done does seem to suggest that there's a fair amount of parking, maybe different vehicles at different times of the day, but a similar level of parking in the evening as during the daytime. Which...
One of the traffic surveys was taken on a weekday and one was on a weekend, right, to compare the difference in availability. Mm-hmm. But as has been observed by the residents, it's not because they're struggling to park on street, it's because of safety and danger, which can be addressed by alternate measures.
So, I mean, on the plan of the estate already marks a number of yellow lines. That there are, presumably the issue is where there aren't yellow lines further into the estate. Is that the problem? You know, where we
well, I don't think we've necessarily got a proposal to put before you. It's we'll add it to the review and see if there are opportunities to improve any key problems.
Yeah, I must say that I am rather surprised about the cost of permits being raised as a significant objection. I mean, it's certainly something which I have expressed concerns about myself in the past. But given that the hours of operation were planned to be 10 till 3, one would think that if somebody needed to have a car for their work, then the likelihood is that it wouldn't be there when the hours of operation were in place anyhow. But you know, obviously people have cars for other reasons apart from commuting. But then, as has been pointed out, some have off-road parking and drives anyhow, don't they? So it's a relatively small number who don't have parking, or maybe don't have enough parking for a number of cars in the household, which is sometimes an issue, isn't it, when you've got sort of younger grown-up children who've got jobs of their own to go to and things like that.
Yeah.
I can appreciate that, you know, different households have different parking needs. So what you're recommending, given the fact that there isn't by any means a clear consensus in support of a scheme, is that we don't progress the scheme, but we identify locations where there are parking issues that warrant further restrictions, and particularly it might be that would those come through the normal sort of process sometime within the next year? Is that what
Yeah,
you're
so
suggesting?
what we tend to do, sorry, Anne-Marie, but what we tend to do is batch these requests together and advertise them in a single process. And then we'll bring them to you for approval before advertising.
Mhm.
Then any that receive objections during that advertising process come back to yourself for decision. Any that go through with no objection, in effect, I sign off because residents are happy with it.
Okay, and presumably the issue about pavement parking, if it's on corners, that would be covered by the double yellow lines. If it's elsewhere, as things stand, we'd have to liaise with the police for enforcement.
Yeah, it would be down to the police to do for obstruction of the highway.
And obviously we can continue, and Ward Council, I'm sure, will continue the dialogue with the college about educating the students and staff about considerate parking if they are parking somewhere on the estate. So I'm happy to approve the recommendation that you've got. Acknowledging, as I said, you know, it may be that it's not the whole solution, but there isn't any clear consensus amongst the residents as to what they would prefer. That takes me on to item 8. And thanks for Jeff being on the call. Sorry, we didn't actually need him. But item 8 is St. Oswald's Road. And I think, again, this one is a first for me in seeing objection to parking restrictions being access to park so you can get into your boat.
Yeah.
This is recommended for lesser restrictions. Does somebody want to explain what the lesser restrictions are?
Jeff, do you want to talk through this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. This is one of the items from the annual review that was wasn't presented to you in last month's decision session. So yes, the original recommendation was to put no waiting at any time restrictions between Connaught Court and actually close. But following 2 site visits and following the representations that we received in objection, there was no obstruction witnessed on those 2 visits. So the recommendation was to implement junction protection for Connaught Court and for Love Lane.
I am familiar with this. This is sort of on the border between my ward and Fulford, in actual fact. And I can see the only concern might have been where I think was raised about parking on alternate sides of the road along the section between Connaught Court and Actually Close, but the houses there all have their own drives. So any parking is probably fairly limited to visitors. So if you've observed it as being not particularly a problem, I'm happy to approve the lesser restrictions as you've indicated, and obviously you can monitor it if that is an issue. I think the only issue might be if there were sort of large vehicles accessing the mobile home set up down Love Lane, but the retirement home, should I say. But I think the recommendations certainly will improve safety on the corner of Love Lane, which is a very popular route for people walking and cycling, but is also a fairly significant access road to where people live now. So I'm happy to approve that item. So then we move on to item 9, which is the TSAR scheme for Barbican Road and Paragon Street.
Hello, Chair.
Going to speak on
There
this
are
one?
no specific updates on this report. I know you're fairly familiar with TSAR. I think you've covered quite a few of these decisions before. Briefly, the 3 primary aims of this programme are to replace life expired traffic signal assets, to bring junctions up to standards, and to include any additional improvements in the immediate vicinity that can be described as easy wins. On the first point, this junction has elements of it that are 20 years old. There are parts that are failing. Currently, it has no working detection, which is impacting on traffic management. A recent survey did not raise any suggestion that there's an imminent safety risk, however. The current design does achieve that first aim. However, I understand it's the third aim that often receives the most interest, that being the additional improvements in the immediate vicinity. To that end, this proposal introduces a fully separated cycle facility on the track and a new segregated crossing. It introduces 2 new pedestrian crossings where there were previously no pedestrian crossings. It introduces an advanced cycle start on the Barbican Road south approach to the junction. And it also includes curb realignments, which provide more space for pedestrians. There are other minor improvements as well that you can see in the report, but those are the key headlines. The proposal's cost estimate is £350,000 for option A, which is the recommendation that we're putting to you today. And we're predicting it would take approximately 7 weeks of construction work to implement. The proposals do reduce capacity at the junction, but not by much. And the traffic assessment shows that the bottleneck in the local area is actually the next junction along. So in reality, we're not expecting much change in terms of congestion or traffic due to these changes. With regards to LTN 120, the junction assessment tool scores this design at 38%, which is quite clearly significantly short of the government's advised 70% for any government funded projects. Of course, we do aim to score as high as we can on the LTN 120 junction assessment tools. But in this case, 38% is the scoring of this particular proposal. And this scheme is not government funded, so we don't have an issue in that regard. That's a high level summary. Do you have any questions?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say very much welcome this, in particular, the change in the configuration to make it more of a T shape, which I think not only gives more space to pedestrians and cycles in the area, but it has the benefit of reducing the sort of general speeds entering Barbican Road. I think, you know, there is a tendency, because traffic has been travelling around the inner ring road for that, you know, is the point of exiting from the inner ring road for speeds to be significantly increased. And also the addition of a box junction, I think, will benefit the flow through this junction, particularly when there's congestion heading towards Walmgate Bar. I've seen it myself, you know, with people actually blocking the westerly movement because they've sort of jumped across when there isn't anywhere to go the other side of the junction. So those particular benefits. There are a couple of points that were raised in some of the representations, and I note it says that they can be looked at in the more detailed design stage. Just wanted to mention One was, the other thing which is particularly of benefit is moving the exit from the car park, which currently comes out into the junction unsignalled, so that it will, vehicles exiting will be behind the signal for the junction. But I think just one sort of detail would be that it would benefit to make it clear the cycle movements across the mouth of that junction, to have that sort of clearly indicated in the surfacing, where the entrance to the new off-road cycle lane is on the plan. And then there was a question was raised. I haven't looked at it in detail to see whether there is actually pavement space to do this, but there was a question raised about whether access from Wellington Street along to the new signalised crossing could be made two-way for cycles along that section, rather than at the moment it's designed with the just the southbound Barbican Road movement for cycles, because the point, I mean, that might actually improve your scoring for LTM 120 as well. If you've got access for cyclists coming from Wellington Street is a low traffic neighbourhood. It's closed off to traffic, but it is quite well used by cyclists coming from the Heslington Road area. At the moment, the design is that they have to come out into across the traffic to join the traffic flow up to that junction, whereas an alternative might be to allow them to join the off-road path alongside the Barbican by crossing over from the new signalised crossing point. But is that sort of what I'm referring to there? You okay with that?
Yeah, well, while I can't promise that we can implement those changes, we can certainly explore those in the detailed design stage.
Look at that, whether that's an option. And there was also one of the points I think was raised by Sustrans. We may be able to live with it, but there was some question about cyclists coming from the direction of from Paragon Street to the new signalised crossing, wanting to actually join the main carriageway leading up to Warmgate Bar, whether they would, on the green phase, they would have to cross the pedestrian phase, which would be in parallel to it, whether that's an issue or not. And one alternative to that might be to make the slip that links from Barbican Road south a two-way, so that cycles are encouraged to come and wait at the, to effectively turn right and wait for the traffic lights to move with the main traffic flow. But again, that's some sort of detail that could be looked at when you're doing some of the detailed design.
Absolutely, yeah. Assuming that is a suggestion that hasn't been responded to already in this report. Later on in section 67, we have addressed some options that haven't been considered. But if I understand you correctly, and that's an additional consideration, we can look at that in the next stage, yes.
Yes, I think so. Because you've I think it was something which was referred to from in the Sustrans representation, so I haven't got the particular reference number now, but there was that question was raised. They've seen a number of representations which have been taken into account, and as I said, quite a few of those do mention the fact that they could be looked at in the detailed design stage as the scheme is implemented. Was just one other point. I think the only other point I was going to make was that there was some a representation from Walk York about the question of near side and far side indicators. And as you've said in the report, I haven't sort of picked up on that specifically for this junction. I think, although I do acknowledge the benefits of retaining far side, near side indicators on the other crossings at Walmgate Junction, which is the next one along from here. So I can see the rationale for that. But I would say that I do want us to explore the whole question about the policy, particularly responding to the representations we've had from disability groups who say in particular locations they prefer the far side indicators. So I'm not applying that to this particular scheme, but I'm just saying that doesn't mean that support the principle across elsewhere. So I think, you know, we do need to look at that again for other schemes.
So what you're saying in effect is on from your perspective, it's on a case by case basis.
Yes, and I think that was certainly I haven't had it as a report as yet to any of the public meetings, but I have had a summary of views from disabled groups when I went around with some officers and looked at a number of crossing points in the city and highlighted some of the issues that we do need to take account of in design that they were asking us to look at. Yeah, okay. So I think, so I'm happy to approve that with those additional points. And I mean, I think there is mention about the ward scheme and the situation on Paragon Street. I will explore that further as a ward councillor, just to try and clarify the position there, if it is going to be something that is relevant to any future planning applications that may come forward. That has been a well-used facility. It might not be quite used as it was designed, but it is nevertheless well used by cyclists who can avoid going on a busy part of the inner ring road for using that facility. So we want to try and make sure we keep that link in there. So I think that concludes that item. Happy to approve that. Urgent business, I have no urgent business. So that concludes the meeting. Thank you everybody for your contributions.